Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much, Cisa, for that kind invitation. I usually say good morning. This is the latest I've ever spoken, so if I ramble on, please forgive me. It's great to be back. Thank you to the IR team and Heather King for inviting me back again. I was not able to attend last year, even though it was Las Vegas, and I was very much looking forward to that. So what I thought I'd do today is talk about your industry and how it relates to Wall Street. So as participants in the global pharmaceutical industry, I thought it made sense to talk about what the fruits of your labor and how they show up in the public markets. Certainly, it's very complicated. As you all know, in the last few years, fundamentals have been overshadowed by many, many things. European bank crises, it goes on and on and on. That said, I'm very optimistic. I have some good news to share. It's one of the most positive outlooks I've had in a long time. So this afternoon I'd like to focus on your industry, drug delivery. But before I do, I'd like to speak about where we've been. So as I said before, the outlook is brightening. We've had 3 very difficult periods behind us. You all know them, but I think I'll take a few minutes to discuss them. So the financial crisis, US healthcare reform, and the patent cliffs, all in the last 5 to 7 years. Not a very fun time. First, let's talk about the financial crisis. As it says here, it looked like the world was coming to an end. I don't know about you, but I thought not only was my company going to go under, but I thought I'd lose my job, and I'm sure probably 75% of you at one time thought the same thing. Every single stock in the world went down. Many stocks went down well over 50%. A couple companies even went bankrupt. For companies in emerging pharmaceuticals, it was not fun. There was no capital available for anybody. Only the largest of the large had access to funding. And many small companies had to sell at very distressed valuations. On Wall Street, it's all about stock prices and graphs. And as here you can see what happened during the financial crisis. Luckily, pharmaceutical stocks did less poorly in the red, simply because everyone has to take their medicine and companies generate a lot of cash flow. But as you can see, the average stock as measured by the S&P 500 was down about 30%, and the biotech stocks were almost down 50%. Healthcare reform. Some people call it Obamacare, whatever you want to call it. It took about 2 years out of our time. And it's now enacted. Obama's been reelected, so there's complete certainty. Cost will be about almost $1 trillion over the next 10 years. The good news is for those who don't have insurance, they'll now have it. It's probably good news for generic drug companies, probably not so good news for doctors. We have significant insurance reforms and individual employer mandates. In stock market terms, we were just coming out of the financial crisis, and so as you can see, stock prices were rising. But the red are the pharmaceutical stocks, and the blue are the average S&P 500 stock. As you can see, there was a pretty significant delta in performance. Investors shied away from healthcare stocks, even more so services and pharmaceuticals, and there was a period of relative underperformance. Patent cliffs. So in the 1990s, we had a bounty of new pharmaceuticals. Every time a new product was launched, it typically generated over $1 billion at peak. I remember the headline in the New York Times saying, Viagra carries the New York Stock Exchange today. So it all changed in the last decade. To make matters worse, there were a lot of drugs that went off patent in the last 5 years, with the biggest dollar amount last year with Lipitor as an $8 billion drug. So you had a combination of poor productivity, drug companies spending $5–6 billion a year in R&D and nothing to show for it, and lots of their fruits of their labors from the previous decade going off patent. So pharma growth rates slowed, and price to earnings multiple, what price you would pay for a unit of earnings, were compressed dramatically. Companies that used to trade at 15 times earnings, their multiples were compressed to 4, 5, 6 times. Pfizer, the poster child. If you held a share of Pfizer in 2000, it was worth almost $50. 9 years later, it was worth about $20. So this chart represents the charts of many large pharma companies, low productivity, billions of dollars of drugs going off patent, multiples compressed. But as you can see here, by 2008, a couple years ago, things were starting to turn. Here you can see it more graphically. Between 2004 and 2010, there was only 1 year when pharma stocks outperformed the market. In good years and bad years, they outperformed. The only year in which they outperformed was during the financial crisis. The average pharma stock was down 19%. The average stock in the markets were down close to 38%. But look, starting in 2011, we're seeing a change. In 2011, pharma stocks actually significantly outperformed the market. Last year, they were in line with the market. And so far this year, the same thing. It's a very encouraging sign. Things are improving, but they're still not great. 20 years ago, when a drug went off patent, it would still keep 50% market share. This year, when a drug goes off patent, you lose 50% share in about a day. Sales growth has also slowed dramatically. Units are growing 1 or 2% in the United States. If you look at Europe and the US, traditionally by far the largest markets in the world, the average script, according to IMS, is barely growing. So, you need to start looking overseas. Everyone talks about emerging markets, but that's where it's going on. Latin America. In Brazil, you have 200 million people. You have 50 million people moving from living under a tree to living in an apartment. 70 people moving from an apartment to a house. It's a cash pay business. They first were able to buy aspirin, now they can buy Lipitor. This is where the growth is. Same thing in Eastern Europe, Russia, Poland. South Africa, the market's growing 21%. And in the US and Europe, there's barely any growth. But there have been some positives, and this is why I'm enthused and other investors are enthused. Post the Obamacare debate, no one on Capitol Hill wants to talk about drug prices. So the good news is companies are taking advantage and jacking up prices. In 2011, prices for many specialty pharma companies, their average price was up about 8 or 9%. This year, we have some companies increasing price 20 and 30%. This is good for revenues, it's good for earnings, not so good for payers. With the downsizing of the industry, companies are now leaner and meaner. They're right-sized for the opportunity. And with the patent cliff era coming to an end, they have a low base in which to grow their earnings with a lower cost structure. And the most important thing is we're now starting to see a more productive R&D cycle. Last year, there were more drugs approved than since 1999. This is encouraging. The last 3 years, there are more and more approvals, and we hope that that trend will continue. Initial public offerings, or IPOs. This is something we watch on Wall Street. It's a leading indicator of interest in the sector. It's a leading indicator of interest in small emerging companies, many drug delivery companies. So look, before the financial crisis, there were about 14 IPOs a year in life sciences. During the financial crisis, there are effectively 0. It's picked up a little bit the last couple of years, but take a look at 2013. In the first month of the year alone, there were 4 IPOs. In fact, one that we and many other firms on Wall Street were involved with, which is called Zoetis. It's the animal healthcare spin-out of Pfizer. They raised $2.5 billion, post-money valuation of $15 billion, 20 times oversubscribed. That means investors put in interest levels at 20 times what they were going to sell. So $25 billion worth of interest for a $2.5 billion IPO. That's a good sign. Now, every 3 years we write a report called Who's Next? The one common theme in specialty pharma drug deliveries is acquisitions. There were 33 announced last year for drug delivery companies. Fundamentals have been thin and they've been very good, but one thing that's constant is mergers of specialty pharma companies. We're now in the 8th year. For the last 5 years, there have been approximately 30 or more acquisitions per year. This is public and private companies. That means there's an acquisition of a specialty pharma / drug delivery company every 5 to 6 business days globally. In 2010, it set an all-time record. Of course, much of this was the acquisition of Alcon by Novartis. And in drug delivery, there's been a pretty stable level of mergers. Now, this, until recently, has been good for the companies that got bought, but not so good for companies like yourselves, if any of you are in private companies, or for investors. There's been a sharp decline in the number of publicly traded companies. Look, between 2008 and 2012, 30 companies have been taken out of the system. So IPOs, new companies; mergers, companies no longer exist. In 2006 and 2007, there was a net addition. But the good news is that last year, there was pretty much a level playing field, 5 IPOs and 6 mergers. And with the advent of all these IPOs so far this year, hopefully there'll be a greater pool of publicly traded companies. They reached a peak in 2004 with 164 companies. Last year, there were 71 publicly traded companies. Earlier up in the food chain is venture capital. As you can see, for 5 years, the amount of money flowing into private companies by venture capital shrunk almost 50%, and the number of companies funded also declined. The good news, as you can see, between 2011 and 2012, the number of companies funded was pretty flat. So hopefully this will start ticking up. That will lead to more IPOs, that will lead to more publicly traded companies, et cetera, et cetera. So why all the mergers? Who are the buyers and who are the sellers? Let's face it, most large drug companies don't have much of a pipeline. How do they grow their earnings? They buy things. They've got lots of cash, $10, $20 billion worth of cash sitting on their balance sheet, but until recently, not very productive R&D. So they are, mid and large cap pharma companies have been significant buyers. Over the last 5 years, companies couldn't go public, so what did they do? They tried to sell themselves. Until recently, when you were on the road as an IPO candidate, people would say, no one wanted to buy you, why are you here? That's changing now. And finally, foreign purchases of US companies. 4 or 5 years ago, Japanese companies couldn't wait to buy specialty pharma companies in the US. Unfortunately, they overpaid and they're now restructuring, but there's always a group of buyers for these companies. Who are the buyers? Branded companies, generic companies, big pharma. They all want critical mass. In the world of generic drugs, you pretty much have 4 behemoths globally. You have Teva, Sandoz, Mylan, Watson. There used to be hundreds of little generic companies. There are very few today. The large companies want to fill in products, geographies, technologies, and some of them are actually moving into the branded arena. Big pharma occasionally buys small drug delivery companies, but increasingly they're buying mid-sized specialty pharma companies. And even private equity, leveraged buyouts are getting into the game because a number of companies, their valuations are so low and their CEOs think there's so much value in these companies that they're actually taking them private. Sellers. Typically, the sellers are companies who've had their product line de-risked, say phase 2, phase 3 studies, or companies with emerging revenue profiles. Many companies are focused on buying, phase 3 assets. The management team realizes it's going to cost $500–600 million to build up a sales force. It's going to take 5 or 6 years to have significant sales, and they decide to sell the company. And what we found in this series of reports we've written is there's a sweet spot. Those companies with market values, and market value is basically the price times the number of shares outstanding. The sweet spot are market valued companies in the public arena between $500 million and $5 billion. Once you get over $5 billion, you're getting pretty big. The pool of eligible buyers shrinks. And under $500 million, you have pretty risky assets. You tend to be in phase 1, phase 2. Once you get through phase 3 or have products on the market, you tend to have over a $500 million valuation. So, as I said, we write this report called Who's Next every 3 years. I have a takeout list I put together during this time. These are just some ideas of companies that could get bought in the next year or two. Shire, global leader in attention deficit disorder drugs, global leader in orphan drugs. Auxilium, You've probably seen the ads for low T, Xylem sells testosterone gel, and they also have a product called Xiaflex for Dupuytren's. Nectar's been around for a long time. They're finally gaining critical mass. They have some late-stage products in development. They even own 100% of their own assets that could be sold. And a local company called Cadence in the pain area is finally getting critical mass with a hospital pain drug, 100 million in sales. That could get acquired as well. And there are many other companies that could get acquired. Okay, so all the mergers have left a vacuum. Very good companies have been acquired. A lot of employees have lost their jobs. But for many founders, this has been extremely lucrative. Here are 5 companies that have been bought in the past 15 years. American Pharmaceutical Partners, generic injectables bought for $3 billion. IVAX, a generic and specialty branded company, bought for $12 billion. Key was actually one of the first ever drug delivery companies. They had a nitroglycerin patch, was bought by Schering-Plough. Coast was founded by the founders of IVAX and Key, so they're already rich, and then they got a lot richer because Coast was sold for $4 billion. And then New River is a company with a prodrug, a new version of Shire's best-selling drug Adderall, and it was sold to Shire for $2.5 billion. And here are the beneficiaries. Each of these 4 men are among the 250 richest people in the country, according to Forbes. Now, I find this very interesting because in pharmaceuticals, drug delivery and specialty pharma is a very small piece. In healthcare, it's an even tinier piece. And when you add it to the US economy, it's minuscule. Specialty pharma and drug delivery revenues are probably 0.001% of the US economy, yet 4 of the 250 wealthiest people in America started specialty pharma companies. So there's an opportunity for you. I would also point out there are 8 billionaires in specialty pharma, and the interesting fact is there are 0 billionaires who started biotech companies. Why? Because in biotechnology you need to do 10 rounds of venture funding, an IPO, 4 secondary offerings, 5 convertible offerings, and you get diluted to almost 0. In specialty pharma, where you're repurposing drugs, you may only need to do a round or 2, so the owners actually, in some cases, own 50% of the company. Let's change gears. We've talked about how the external factors, the market conditions have affected companies like yours and the way you conduct your business. Let's now talk about your industry, drug delivery. The companies in your sector have had to change. External forces, sharp changes in fundamentals, and effectively companies have had to adapt to new realities or die. What's the drug delivery landscape? I know I've expounded on the old drug delivery model for way too long over the years, so I'll just leave you with a couple sentences. It's dead. It's been dead for a while. Any company that believes they can license out their technology for 5% royalties, it's not really a business anymore. And so companies have had to adapt. There are a number of successful companies who have transformed their models, and we'll talk about that in a second. All right, so the first bullet has 2 companies that have been around a long time, 20 years plus, Alkermes and Nectar. But they've adapted. They're now on their way to becoming successful operating companies. The companies at the bottom, they're still around. They aren't going anywhere. Alkermes and Nectar. Alkermes, when they went public in 1990, they had a drug to penetrate the blood-brain barrier. Didn't work. Then they got into aerosols. Didn't work, but still they're opportunistic, have a drug called Consta, which is a version of Risperdal. They acquired Elan's drug delivery technologies. They even got crafty and lowered their tax rate by buying an Irish company. And as you can see, their stock in mid-2008 was $9, and today it's about $20. Nectar Therapeutics used to be called Inhale. They effectively had the right product at the absolute wrong time. You may recall Pfizer put $3 billion into Exubera, also known as inhaled insulin, and it was a bomb. So at one point they had a $100 stock, it went to $5, but when they had a high-priced stock, they bought a pegylation business. That transformed the company. As you can see here, mid-08, the stock went from 5 to 15. They signed a very lucrative deal with AstraZeneca. They have an interesting cancer product that they own 100% of. After that, of course, the stock went down because there was concerns they didn't have enough cash. That's been fixed, and the stock is now off to the races again. So these are two companies that have been around a long time. They started off licensing their molecules, and now they're more fully integrated and have adapted to the new realities. Those companies that didn't, look at this. No matter whether it's 3 years, 5 years, or 10 years, those are ugly, ugly numbers. 3 of these companies, their stocks have gone down almost 100% to close to 0 in the last 10 years, and even in the last 3 years, you can say it has not been fun.